broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Burke, and I am here with Andy Capehart, and we're with the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center, also known as APS TARC, and we want to welcome you to this webinar with our presenter, Anna Thomas, who I will introduce shortly. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I would like to share a little bit of information. This webinar is being hosted by the APS TARC, which is a project of the U.S. Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging, Department of Health and Human Services, and is administered by the WRMA Incorporated. Contractors' findings, conclusions, and points of view do not necessarily represent the official policy of the federal government. Next slide, please. Now a little bit about the APS TARC if you're not familiar. The mission of the APS TARC is to enhance the effectiveness of APS programs by working with partners on the use of data and analytics, applying research and evaluations to practice, encouraging the use of innovative practices and strategies, and providing individualized technical assistance to APS programs. We're here to help you in any way that we can. Just reach out to us using the contact information that will be displayed at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Please join us for Let's Talk APS, our monthly peer support discussions. We host 2 informal collaborative peer calls each month. Practice to discuss training, investigation, case planning, which is the 3rd Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern and 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and program management, which is to discuss policy and program issues, which is the 4th Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Reach out to us using the contact info displayed at the end of this webinar to join. Next slide, please. Just a friendly note that the National Adult Protective Services Training Center, the NATC, has launched, and the no-cost APS core program e-learning courses are available for APS professionals to access. Please visit the website on the slide for additional information. These really are great courses. Next slide, please. Now on to some housekeeping. In the handout section of your webinar control panel, you will find today's slides. You may download these at any time. Please use your computer speakers to access the audio for this webinar. Please make sure the speaker volume is adjusted to your desired volume. If you do experience audio problems during the presentation, we recommend that you sign out of the webinar and re-enter to log back in. Next slide, please. You may ask questions or share comments by typing them into the questions box at any time during the webinar. We will relay as many as we can during the question and answer portion of this webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the TARC website along with a copy of the slides. We will notify all registrants via email when it is posted online and announce their availability more broadly through the APS TARC outreach channels. Everyone attending today will receive an email approximately 24 hours later with a link to download your certificate of attendance. CEUs are not offered for this webinar though. And please be sure to take the brief eval survey when prompted. We always love to hear your feedback. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to launch a quick attendee poll so we can get a sense of who our audience is today. We're going to launch that question now. The question is, what profession do you identify most closely with? And this is a single choice answer. Adult Protective Services, medical, legal, other social services, or other profession. We'll leave that up here for a few seconds. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and close that poll and see who we have in the room. All right, so 85% Adult Protective Services, well represented today. We have 1% medical, 2% legal, 10% other social services, wonderful, and 2% other profession. Thank you so much for taking that poll. Next slide, please. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Anna Thomas. Anna Thomas is the manager of the Division of Aging Services, Forensic Special Initiatives Unit, and a forensic specialist with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crimes Against the Elderly and Disabled Task Force, also known as CADE. CADE's mission is to protect elder and disabled adults from abuse, neglect, and exploitation, prevent abuse, neglect, and exploitation of elder and disabled adults, and to prosecute offenders. Currently, her work with the CADE task force centers on training primary and secondary responders on how to recognize and respond to elder and disabled adult abuse, researching gaps in current victim services, developing new laws to protect vulnerable adults, and public outreach. Her most recent projects are the launch of the statewide elder abuse multidisciplinary teams, MDTs, and raising awareness of benefits trafficking. So Anna, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that introduction, and I am excited to be here with everyone today. Thank you, all of you who are tuning in from all over. We really appreciate it. Again, my name is Anna Thomas, and I want to speak to you about the intersection between human trafficking and adult protective services. Next slide, please. Here is the fair use notice. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, that the information in this presentation may contain copyrighted material, which is attributed to the copyright owner. This material is used for educational purposes in an effort to explain issues relevant to the practice and development of investigations involving crimes against elderly adults and adults with disabilities. Material in this presentation is distributed for research and educational purposes and for the public good. Next slide, please. In our time together today, here's what we hope to accomplish. I would love to have a great discussion, so please put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to talk about and examine the power of collaboration. We're going to explore benefits trafficking together. We'll run through a couple of case examples. We'll talk about the indicators of the crime. I always want to give you some takeaways about what to look for when you're out in the field. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with how the state of Georgia, how our response to this crime has been. Next slide, please. All right, Jessica, I think we're ready for our first poll.
All right,
So
thank you, Anna.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Our first question is, are you familiar with the term benefits trafficking? So please select one, yes or no. So we'll leave that open for a few seconds there. Give you a few more seconds. So, are you familiar with the term benefits trafficking? All right, Andy, let's go ahead and close that poll. And 35% of you said yes, and 65% of you said no. Okay.
That's wonderful. That's great. So we get a chance to educate a few of you and that haven't heard about this before, and then perhaps refamiliarize some of you that have heard about this before. I believe it was a couple of months ago in the APS TARC listserv, the question was put out by one of our neighboring states if anyone had experienced benefits trafficking in their state and what they were doing to address the problem. And it was wonderful to read the responses that some people identified it. And then there were some responses that said, you know, this may be a misnomer or maybe not the correct use of the word trafficking. So I'm hoping that I will dispel that myth as we go through our discussion today, and that we can just talk about how this is definitely human trafficking. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about some terminology just to level set us where we are, because we're coming from all different parts of the country and we all use different terms, right? So as you know, I am from Georgia, and I was born and raised here. So you may hear me use this first word, the word y'all. You may hear me use that during this presentation. It is just part of my my language and a term that I use. It's a term of endearment, definitely. Some of you may have heard this term, bless your heart. It is a kind of a southern sweet insult. If someone says bless your heart, know that they may be kind of giving you a little bit of an insult. The term hotlanta, yes, it is very hot right now in Georgia. However, those of us that live here, we do not use this term. If you come to visit us and you say it's hotlanta, you may get a bless your heart from some of the people that are from here. And that's okay, that's all right. I encourage you to come visit us. Just right now it's really hot, so maybe don't come in the summertime. Another term that I'm gonna share with you today is at-risk adult. And so for us here in Georgia, that means an elder person that is 65 years of age or older. Or that can mean, and that can mean a disabled adult or adult with disabilities that's 18 or older, has a disability or has Alzheimer's or dementia, which is written into our law, and also a resident in a long-term care facility. So at-risk adult is an umbrella term that we use to encompass all three of those types of individuals. Next slide, please. Another term that we use is personal care homes. And the way that's described here in Georgia is any dwelling, whether operated for profit or not, which provides or arranges for housing, food service, or one or more personal services for 2 or more adults that are not related to the owner or administrator by blood or marriage. So we call those personal care homes. Next slide, please. What I've heard in talking to different people across the country is those are sometimes called group homes or board and care homes. I want to make sure that I've level set that so we know exactly what we're talking about here today. But also we have an epidemic of unlicensed personal care homes. So they operate a lot like personal care homes, right? But the conditions are often deplorable. The residents, they're neglected, they're not fed, so they're not given food, they don't have clothing that's appropriate for the weather conditions, they are financially exploited, and they experience false imprisonment. So when we hear me talk about an unlicensed personal care home, I hope I've painted that picture for you. But I do have some slides to illustrate what I'm talking about. Next slide, please. When we talk about human trafficking, there's a few things that pop up right into our mind, right? We think about sex trafficking, we think about young underage girls or boys that are trafficked for sex, right? But we also have labor trafficking, that's a type of trafficking, and human organ trafficking, which we don't talk much about that, but these are our 3 main types of trafficking that come to mind when we talk about human trafficking. Next slide, please. What I want to bring to you today is we're going to talk about this newest level of trafficking called benefits trafficking. And again, you'll hear me interchange that with, having an unlicensed personal care home. And it's in these unlicensed personal care homes where benefits trafficking is taking place. Next slide. There is a human trafficking model, a federally recognized model for human trafficking. And that consists of the act, the means, and the purpose. And as you can see here, there's the act. What we typically think about, somebody's being recruited or being transported from place to place or transferred. They're being received by an individual, and there could be somebody on the other end that is harboring these individuals, these victims. The means that our traffickers use, threats, coercion, duress, false promises, they abuse their power across the board. There's a lot of fraud and deception, a lot of false promises. And what's the purpose in all of this? Well, depending on the type of trafficking that we're talking about, that could be servitude, that could be sexual exploitation, removal of organs or forced labor, but really across the board, it is exploitation. Next slide, please. So let's flip that and talk about what the benefits trafficking model looks like. It's very similar, but again, we're focused on these at-risk adults, so our elderly, disabled population, right? So the act, what does that look like for benefits trafficking? There's still recruitment and referral, but it's through legitimate means, legitimate places such as hospitals. That includes mental health hospitals, shelters for those that are unhoused, churches, online, through other licensed facilities. And what does that means look like? The means are promises of benefits and services that are never delivered. There's a false representation here. The traffickers, they use coercion, deception, duress, and brainwashing. And hold on to that brainwashing point there as we go through the case examples that we're going to talk about. And what is the purpose of this? The purpose is exploitation of the benefits that are attached to that at-risk adult. And that's really any type of government benefit. So SNAP, EBT, food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, all of those types of benefits. So as you can see, benefits trafficking fits the human trafficking model, but there's just a few different nuances there. That's what makes it so unique. Next slide, please. So in Georgia, we actually have a law against this type of trafficking, and it was passed in 2018, and it's called benefits trafficking. And it's mirrored after our human trafficking law that was already on the books. But as you can see there in that subsection B, we talk about this certain type of population. We list a disabled adult, an elder person, or a resident. It's a very specific type of trafficking. And the penalty there, as you can see on the screen, is up to 20 years in prison and a $100,000 fine. Next slide, please. So across the country, we've talked about this. Our team has talked about it nationally. We've gone to other conferences, talked to other states about this, because we thought we are not the only state this is happening in. There's no way. And we were right. All these other states that you see here on the screen with the stars have identified this type of trafficking. So when we're finished today, if your state is not listed on here and you have seen this, please get in touch with me. I'd love to put a star next to your state. And the reason we're trying to identify the different states is that we really want to show the federal government that this is a type of trafficking that is happening. And we always want to do some outreach and some awareness so that other states can hopefully model what we've done here in Georgia and roll it out to their state. Next slide, please. I want to talk to you specifically about the power of collaboration. This is something that I learned early on in talking about benefits trafficking and investigating these cases, that the collaboration and the collaborative aspect of them is really key when it comes to serving these at-risk adult victims. Next slide, please. So let me ask you, Jessica, to launch this next poll about the challenges of collaboration.
All right, so here is our next poll. So what are your challenges to collaboration? And again, this is a single choice answer. So conflicting mission, limited chances to interact, or egos. So we'll give you a few seconds to take that poll. So what are your challenges? And if it's not listed on here, which one of these three do you most identify with? Give you a few more seconds. All right, Andy, let's go ahead and close that poll. So it looks here, so conflicting mission, we have 26%, limited chances to interact, 62%, that looks like the number one, and egos is 12%. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Great. And I appreciate everyone's feedback, that limited chances to interact. And we'll talk about that. We'll go through that here in a few slides. All right, next slide, please. And we have a last poll, poll number 3. Jessica, if you could launch that one too.
All right, so with what agency do you need to grow your collaborative efforts? Single choice answer, law enforcement, APS, victim services, or federal agencies? Give you a few seconds to take this one too. Collaboration, a few more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and close that poll. All right, so almost half of you, 46% said law enforcement, 14% said APS, victim services is 18%, and then federal agencies is 22%.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Andy. So law enforcement, that is where we need to grow our collaborative efforts the most. And based on the last poll, it was there's limited ways of interaction, limited chances to interact. So that's wonderful. That's great feedback. Next slide, please. I'm going to use this case in Albany, Georgia to illustrate the power of collaboration. So hold on to your thoughts about needing to collaborate more with law enforcement and those limited chances of interaction as we go through this case. Next slide, please. If you aren't familiar with Georgia, this is what our state looks like. And this case happened in Albany, Georgia. So that is that red county there at the bottom. The blue star is showing you where Atlanta is, so you can kind of orient yourself a bit. So we're talking about South Georgia here. We're talking about South Georgia, summertime. It is hot. We call that below the gnat line because there's lots of gnats down there. It is hot. Next slide, please. So we want to talk about our trafficker. Let's pause for a minute and talk about her advertisement. Remember how I said that traffickers will use recruitment through legitimate means. And this was actually the website of the trafficker. Very legitimate looking website here on the left. And I highlighted some of the important parts of her advertisement here. So 24-hour supervised facilities. That sounds fantastic. If you're trying to place someone, you need those 24-hour supervised facilities. She does a lot of things: housing, payee services, medical management and med management. She has on-site doctors and counselors. She also does case management. So like the more you read, the better it sounds, right? Plus, she's been doing this for over 15 years. So you know she's got great experience. And it sounds really too good to be true, right? Next slide, please. That's because it was too good to be true. That was what she advertised, but this is actually what she got. These were a section in a neighborhood, section of apartments and houses that were boarded up that had been flooded out in Albany. That part of our state had suffered through some floods the previous years, and code enforcement had shut these houses down, actually. But she had these individuals in her care and moved them from close to the metro area because she had a feeling that law enforcement, adult protective services were onto her. So she takes them and moves them, traffics them down to Albany, down to South Georgia. Next slide, please. This is another one of the houses that she had warehoused these individuals in. Some of the houses didn't have any doors. The doors were missing. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There's no AC. Again, we're in South Georgia. It's hot. Next slide, please. And let me show you what the inside of these facilities look like. Peeling floors, there's bed bugs in the bed that you see there, and all of the furniture, all the bedding. It's dirty, it's deplorable. You do see a fan there in that middle picture. That fan was brought into the house from APS. APS was trying to, once they figured out this was happening, was trying to relocate these victims and trying to cool them down, give them the care that they needed. Next slide, please. So a little bit about this case. So the concerned neighbors in the neighborhood knew something was happening because people were begging for food. These residents, these victims, they weren't getting fed, and they're wandering up and down the street begging for food. Like I said, these apartments had been condemned by code enforcement, and when code enforcement, condemned them, shut them down, she waited until code enforcement was finished with their investigation, and she moved them back in. So we have 4 defendants in all, and there were around 14 victims. Next slide, please. And here is the mastermind. This was our trafficker. She was found guilty at trial and sentenced to 20 years with 7 years to serve. She's to have no contact with the victims. And I love that the prosecutor put this in here, that she cannot own, operate, or associate with any entity providing care to another person. She cannot receive any money or have any active business with any agency providing care to a disabled adult or an elder person or any person unrelated to the defendant. Again, we're trying to stop her from getting back into this trafficking life. We're trafficking these individuals back and forth across the state. Next slide, please. So let me tell you about that collaboration piece. APS was key to this case. This is the case that we used that brought to light that we needed a benefits trafficking law. And this was a case that really gave us a great blueprint and roadmap of collaboration, how to work amongst different agencies that speak different languages and get the job done of protecting these at-risk adults. So what did APS do? They provided care and necessities to these victims to kind of keep them sustained while they were in there trying to relocate them. And there was a whole operation that was planned to relocate all of these multiple victims. They assisted in that relocation. They secured transport and they assessed the victims at the scene. They were like triaging these victims to see what they needed. They kept track of all of these victims. They kept notes and provided information and updates on the progress, where these people have been relocated to, where the victims were, and to make sure that, it says we, to make sure that law enforcement and to make sure that the prosecutor had contact with the personal care home owner that took them in. And why would they do that? Well, they had to follow up. They had some questions. Law enforcement had some questions for these individuals, and APS was that nexus. They were saying, hey, this person is located, over in this county. We've got their information. We can show you where they are. And APS had a good relationship with these people. Some of these victims were a little nervous to talk to law enforcement, but APS had smoothed that over. And let me tell you, APS gave such compelling testimony at trial that really helped convict this individual. And I, for one, and my team as well, we are extremely honored to be able to work next to Georgia's APS team because they are outstanding. Next slide, please. Again, back to collaboration. Look at all these involved agencies that took down this trafficking ring. It was a lot of people, and people that we don't work with all the time, right? So of course you've got adult protective services, but let's start on the left over here. The fire marshal. We don't often work with the fire marshal. We had law enforcement, multiple law enforcement agencies, different prosecutors, so the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit and the local prosecutor and the state elder abuse prosecutor. Obviously, a licensed provider is going to take these people in, so that agency is going to be involved. These people needed medical attention. They had been starved, they had been neglected, they were malnourished, they were dehydrated, so we had to work with medical providers. Mental health providers. Many of these individuals had mental health concerns and needed to get stabilized. The long-term care ombudsman was also involved in this relocation. Social Security office. A lot of these individuals, most of them had Social Security. They had a representative payee, which was one of the defendants. So we had to get their Social Security rerouted back to them, back into their own hands. State regulators who examine these unlicensed personal care homes and investigate them. Code enforcement was out there too, and our Attorney General's office. So take a minute to look at this honeycomb of all the different people that had to come together to break down working in those silos and be able to collaborate to fully restore the dignity of these trafficked victims, but to also take down and just hold that offender accountable. Next slide, please. One thing I want to impart to you about collaboration is a lot of the work that we do is in those silos. But if we stay in those silos, we're not going to be able to protect our vulnerable adults. We've got to be innovative in how we cross the different sections and the different agencies, and we have to build bridges. We can't just wait for the opportunity. We need to build those bridges before we get to a situation that's an emergency situation where we need those bridges, where we need that collaboration. Next slide, please. Let's take a minute to talk about the survivors. They too are going to be surrounded by so many different agencies, and the best way to serve them is if all of these different agencies and entities are talking together, are speaking together. So that survivor doesn't have to go from one to the next to keep telling their story over and over and over again. So these different entities like law enforcement, prosecutor's office, the licensed personal care home, medical, ombudsman, APS, the regulatory agencies, mental health providers, all have to encircle these victims. They have been stripped of their dignity as a trafficking victim, so they have to be built back up and be restored to that place of having dignity and respect. And it takes all of us to do that. Next slide, please. So that was one case example that really illustrated the power of collaboration. I want to talk you through a couple of others that we've investigated that can illustrate what benefits trafficking looks like. Next slide, please. We are going to start out in DeKalb County. Next slide. DeKalb County there, as you can see in red, is considered a metro county. It's really close to Atlanta, and it is a metro Atlanta county. Next slide, please. And a bit of a warning that the following video does contain adult language, also known as swearing. I showed this video to a group of people and did not have that warning in there, and I was told that I needed a warning, so I definitely heeded their advice and put a warning in. Next slide, please.
The first time I spotted Mr. Hill, he was walking down Clifton Springs Road. It was just weird to have someone walking down the street with a sweater on, some shorts, carrying a big blanket. So I decided to turn around and have a little chat with him. Hey, you okay? Initially, he told me that he was being held hostage in a basement. A basement? I'm not gonna lie, I thought he probably was a little crazy, but something was going on and I was like, okay, well, let me see if there's some truth to this. He was able to tell me his name, his date of birth, the last address on his license, so he was coherent enough. And he actually said to me, he said, I know I sound crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. I patted him down before I put him in my car. Well, he actually handed me some bent up nails. So he explained to me that she actually took the nails and bent them to lock him inside of the room, and the nails held the door together. At that point, I put him into the unit, and then we proceeded to drive around so we could try to find the house. I proceeded to ask him, do you know what your house looks like? He tells me no, he's only seen the house once, and that was when she brought him initially to the residence.
Mr. Hill had been in the basement, and he could hear what was going on above him, in the house above him. There was a family up there, there was a dog, and he recognized the bark of the dog.
That could be it right there.
Right here. At that point, the dog is barking. He says, this is the house, this is the house. He's pointing at the house. I get out as I make my way towards the residence. I come in contact with Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler was dirty. He had a lot of, crust and stuff on his face like that. He was walking very slow. It looked like he was malnourished.
and she asked him who lives in this house.
Do you live with someone in the basement?
And that's when he told her that there was another guy, but he had busted out that morning. And she realized, wow, that this maybe this is true.
Is this Mr. Hill? He came over, identified Mr. Hill for me. At that point, I asked him to show me where he was, staying in the basement. He proceeded to walk me around the side of the house, and we came to a door at the back of the residence. When I saw what I had, I called for some units to help me secure the location because it was a pretty big house. I called detectives, crime scene out so we could get a search warrant, make sure everything was processed legally. So the chain of custody was there.
It was so wonderful that she thought to get a search warrant, to bring a detective to the scene, to bring crime scene out to the scene, to take the photographs and to do everything properly. And that means it was all recorded and I was able to use it as evidence.
While we were out here investigating, Miss Faust actually pulled up into the driveway. She was in an Escalade, her daughter was in the passenger seat. At that point, I did transport her down to CID headquarters.
This is Detective Russell. I'm out at Clifton Springs Manor. I'm out with Johnny Ray Hill. What's the living conditions like where you were staying?
The door is locked all the time until she comes in to feed her.
Okay.
Which is twice a day.
All right, what about sleeping? What do you sleep on?
One single bed. You should see his damn bed. That looks like a damn trampoline for a kid.
What about shower?
It's a aluminum bowl under the table there in the room.
Does she fill that up every day?
No, about every 2 weeks.
What about restroom?
It's a paint bucket, discarded paint bucket. That's what you do 1 and 2 in. Peeing and shitting.
Okay.
And that's it.
Anytime elderly or disabled people are exploited, it's always about money. The detective was looking not just to see what was happening in the basement, which is where the 2 men were living, but they also searched the upstairs. He found a bank statement that had Johnny Hill's name on it and also had Chandra Faust's name on it. And she had actually added her name to his bank account and that's how she was able to spend all of his checks. And we have actually had photographs of Chandra Faust accessing his funds.
Now, did you ever talk with her about putting her name on either one of your bank accounts?
Absolutely not.
Did you ever let anyone else have permission to take money out of your account to a debit card?
Absolutely not.
Or did you give anyone permission to write checks on your account and take your money out?
Absolutely not.
The grand jury indicted Ms. Faust on false imprisonment, exploitation of a disabled adult, 2 counts of abuse of a disabled adult, and also 2 counts of theft by taking. She was sentenced to 20 to serve 10, and that means 10 years in custody, followed by 10 additional years on probation.
It felt real good to see Ms. Faust go to jail for what she did. To take someone's freedom from them unwillingly, to me, is very bad, but crimes against elderly people who can't help themselves. She was praying for her own financial gains.
I think the most important thing that Yolanda did was give him some credence. She listened and she investigated what he had to say, even though it sounded a little bit crazy.
I think Officer Shields is an excellent example of what a police officer can do and what a difference they can make. Going with that gut feeling that something doesn't feel right and pursuing it until her concern is satisfied.
Elder abuse is occurring pretty much in every city and every county in Georgia, along with throughout our nation. If there's financial exploitation occurring, then usually there's either abuse and or neglect occurring at the same time.
Mr. Hill went into a much better place. It was paid for with his check. It was not a homeless shelter and it was not somebody's basement. I went to see him there and he was very happy. He was able to tell his story and he didn't have to tell it from beyond the grave like he thought he might.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that video, Andy. And some of the things that stood out from that video to me is how they say, well, Officer Shields went with her gut, right? And she investigated. I want to say that that has been my experience with Adult Protective Services here in Georgia. They just went with their gut and they knew something was wrong, that this was an unlicensed personal care home, and they busted these cases wide open. So it's not just for law enforcement, it's definitely for Adult Protective Services too. Next slide, please. If you are interested in showing that video to people in your agency, or if you want to use this as to launch a conversation into collaboration, you can find that video on the Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement. And I believe after the webinar, it will be linked in the future. But you can find it right here. It's under roll call videos, and I believe it's entitled False Imprisonment. But you can download it, you can show it. And again, it is a great way to start having a conversation. Y'all mentioned that we needed to collaborate more with law enforcement. That's a wonderful way to start and say, hey, look, we've identified this, or we think this is happening in the community. How can we partner and collaborate with you to work to help these cases move along, to investigate these cases, and to assist with the victims of trafficking? Next slide, please. So let's go back to the video for just a second. You saw in that video, this was the basement where the two gentlemen were kept. And what had happened is Ms. Faust just kind of rolled up to a shelter for unhoused individuals and asked, you know, who gets a check here? And these two gentlemen raised their hand. She was like, all right, well, come live with me. I'll take you in. I'll take care of you. I'll feed you. It's better than living in this shelter. And so she actually moved them into her home under the pretense and that false representation that she was going to take care of them. Well, she also had a TV down there. You can kind of see it at the left there. And the gentleman, our two victims, called that the babysitter because it was on all the time and it kept them entertained. And it was on CSI. And so Mr. Hill said, I knew about DNA because I watched CSI all the time. And he told the investigators that he thought he was going to die in that basement and no one would ever know that he had been in that basement. So he pulled out a piece of his hair for every day that he was stuck and locked into that basement, and he hid it under the lamp. So while officers are doing their search warrant, next slide, please. Pick up that lamp, and there is the clump of his hair. Great visual illustration about just how long he had been in that basement. Unfortunately, our trafficker pled guilty, and so the prosecutor did not get that great moment to use this evidence in trial. But, you know, smart man, he had just fallen on some hard times, did not have anyone to care for him, family and friends, and this is where he ended up. And that is a common theme that we'll see with a lot of the victims of benefits trafficking. They don't have family or friends to care for them anymore, and they're kind of stuck in this pattern, and they end up into the hands of a trafficker. Next slide, please. So like I said, there was a guilty plea in this case. For breakfast, these two gentlemen, if they were fed, they were given ramen noodles or bologna for dinner, and that is a common theme because it's cheap, right? The traffickers don't want to spend money on food. That's overhead for them. They want that money in their pocket. So for this guilty plea, our trafficker was sentenced to 10 years in prison and to pay $3,000 in restitution. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to crisscross Georgia a little bit and head down to Augusta. Next slide, please. Augusta borders South Carolina, and you can see it's right there in the red, so it's kind of over on the side a little bit, away from Atlanta. And the reason I wanted to show you where these places are is because it is happening everywhere in our state. It's not just a metro Atlanta type problem, not just a South Georgia problem. It is happening everywhere in our state. Next slide, please. So this picture that you see here, these are the law enforcement agencies, was an early MDT, a multidisciplinary team in Augusta, and they were at the trafficker's house, and they are doing a search warrant there at her house once this case had actually busted open. So what happened and how we got even involved in this case is that state regulators were investigating her licensed facility. She did actually have a licensed facility. And she got wind that, okay, they're coming. They're going to find out that I've got a lot of these unlicensed homes too, and they're going to take these people away from me. She was hoarding people in these unlicensed personal care homes that she had. So she started dropping them off around Augusta and across into South Carolina at motels to hide them out. She didn't want law enforcement or APS to take them away from her. So she would drop them off without any food, without any medicine, and without a caretaker. And luckily, one of the motel operators called police because he had an individual staying there that could not pay for his room. He was also a disabled adult. He didn't have anybody to care for him. He was sitting in urine and feces, and he didn't have any food. So then law enforcement figured out, okay, she's had other people in her care and she hid them out. So they started going to different motels to try to locate these people. And lastly, most of these residents were actually placed in her care by behavioral health case managers. And they were receiving behavioral health services. So that is at no fault of the behavioral health case managers. They did not know they were placing people into a trafficking situation. They put them in her licensed home, which was, above board and perfectly fine. And then she would kind of triage them and then move them into her other unlicensed homes. Next slide, please. So here is a picture of her in court. Prior to her getting caught, she collected approximately $120,000. That's a lot of money, just in victim Social Security checks, the 3 years before she was caught. So think about that money. That money, she's not reporting it to the IRS. It's under the table. It is untaxed money into her pocket. She also had disabled residents that were left in charge of other residents because she had a lot of unlicensed homes and takes a lot of people to run those. So she would get what she called the highest functioning person and put them in charge of other individuals. She would pay that person with cigarettes. We often refer to that as the keeper of the key. Reason being is that that person who is in charge of other people will typically have a key in their pocket or around their neck. And that key could be the key to the front door, which is usually locked, or a key to the medicine, which is locked, or even a key to the refrigerator or the pantry, because the traffickers don't want these victims accessing more food. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison and 20 years on probation. Next slide, please. So let's talk about these initial engagement with the survivors. And you are out in the house, you are out on the scene. There's a few things I want you to remember. These residents, they may be brainwashed. So what does that mean? Remember early on I said, hold on to that point. What that means is these traffickers are smart and they're con artists, and they have really gotten into the psyche of our victims, and they've said, I'm the only one caring for you. Look, it's kind of like emotional abuse, right? I'm the only one caring for you. You have nowhere else to go but with me. Law enforcement, APS, they're bad. They're going to take you away. That kind of brainwashing. So you may need to build trust when you're out there with them initially. They're not going to trust you right away. You may be viewed as, quote, the bad guys, APS or social services or any regulatory agency, law enforcement, prosecutors. Y'all may be viewed as being bad. They may not want to talk to you initially, right? They've been told not to talk to you. And the residents may want to protect that trafficker. That trafficker has put themselves in a position of trust, and those victims really do trust that trafficker. However, I encourage you, once these individuals, these victims are relocated into a safe place, please go back and talk to them, because that is when those disclosures start to happen. That's when they start to tell you the story about exactly what happened to them while they were being trafficked. Next slide, please. We've come up with a resident questionnaire. It was developed by our task force. And really, we sat down and thought about what are some important questions that whoever's on the scene is going to need to ask these individuals. It really takes the time to establish the trafficker's role. These questions get to the heart of what was that trafficker actually providing for the victims, but it also may lead to other homes and other victims. So some sample questions is, who lives here with you? What medicines do you take? Do you get any food? If so, how often and what are you fed? So their responses to these questions are going to really illustrate the conditions that they were living in. They may not, for example, be able to tell you exactly what medicine they were given, the brand name, but they may be able to tell you that they were given medicines that made them sleep all day long, or if they started to leave out the front door, they were given even more medicine so they wouldn't escape, right? It does kind of illustrate and sets the scene with the resident questionnaire. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some of the common indicators of benefits trafficking. So when you're out in the field, some of these things you'll remember, and they'll pop up and you'll say, okay, I saw this on that webinar. I need to look into this a little bit further. Next slide, please. Some themes and trends. Again, this is through all of our investigations, this high level, what we've encountered that we want to pass on to you. So each resident is paying a large amount of money for maybe half a bedroom, if that, maybe a quarter of a bedroom. The refrigerator's padlocked, I mentioned that, and sometimes the residents are fed only once a day. They only get one meal. Residents don't have access to their own money. They may not even know where their money's going. They typically have behavioral health conditions. There is, at times, a licensed home and several unlicensed homes, and these look just like regular homes on the outside. Next slide, please. And here's some examples of cases that we've worked, trafficking situations. These are regular looking homes that you would find anywhere in our state. They don't look like there's criminal activity happening inside. So a lot of times these are in normal residential neighborhoods and you just wouldn't know what's happening on the inside. Next slide, please. When you're out in the field and you think you're investigating one of these, look in these storage areas. Storage areas are used to warehouse residents. You wouldn't think there's somebody in there, but there is. And I encourage you to check the entire property. This Coachman camper that you see on the screen, there were actually trafficking victims in there. It's overgrown, there's no air conditioning in it, but there's actually people were being trafficked in that Coachman. So I encourage you to check everywhere, even if you think, no, there's no way somebody's living there. You know, you might be the person that discovers them and actually rescues them. Next slide, please. Look for a lack of running water. So look at the utilities, see if they are actually working, if the water's running. Buckets used as toilets, that is a common theme that we have seen as well. Next slide, please. Look for locks. Where are they? You know, look where they are on the door or on the gate. This example on the left, the lock is on the outside of the gate. Right? So the goal is to keep outsiders out of the home. Traffickers don't want people in there. They don't want social services, law enforcement. And also the goal is to keep the residents inside and to lock up the food and the medicine. So take a look at where the locks are. Next slide, please. And let's talk about the financial exploitation. How do we assess the financial exploitation? We know that that is the root of all of this. Next slide, please. This trafficker had multiple EBT cards, and you can see most of those are Georgia, but there's a couple Alabama ones in there too. So leads us to know that this was crossing state lines. She had all these EBT cards, these SNAP, food stamp cards, and on the back, she had the date that the money would get on the card and the PIN number. So she could rifle through her pocketbook, her wallet, and get all, the card that she needed that day to buy food for herself, for her family, and not for the people she was supposed to be caring for. Next slide, please. We've also developed some financial questions to help you look at the financial piece, to help law enforcement, to help APS, anyone that's really looking at these cases, to figure out where the money's going, to follow that money trail. So you want to establish the trafficker's role. You want to look for rep payee abuses, because there are going to be rep payee abuses, but it also may lead to co-conspirators in this type of trafficking. So some sample questions you can see here on the screen, just asking the residents, are you charged for food? What are your sources of income? They may say, I've got a retirement from Delta and I've also got Social Security. Who is controlling your income? So do you ever touch your money, or does it just go into somebody else's pocket? And take a look at these benefits. Are they being used for the good of the resident, or are they being used for the benefit of the trafficker? Next slide, please. And two, we ask that you follow the drugs. There's a lot of healthcare fraud, and this was something that was a big concern early on. Was when we were talking to different people about this, they're like, oh, this is just healthcare fraud, or this is just civil. And there is a healthcare fraud component, but it's way more than that. So the healthcare fraud, the traffickers are charging for services that are not provided. Blister packs of medicines are often found in these houses. There's other involved parties, such as pharmacists, nurses. So again, that partnership and that collaboration with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit is really helpful to take down these operations. Next slide, please. What about the traffickers? We've talked a lot about our victims. Let's take a look at the traffickers. Next slide, please. Some common findings that we have seen with traffickers. Oftentimes they're female. They will say they are doing God's work. Their organizations will have a religious connotation in the name, or they will say, they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing this because God called them to. If they are living in the same house that they're trafficking people in, their side of the house is very clean, or their own house is clean. They are con artists. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They are con artists. They're often known to the community. We had one trafficker who received an award from the commissioners because she had opened up a home to take in people that didn't have anywhere to go. So they're well known to the community, and they're just out there hiding in plain sight. They will talk to law enforcement. They will probably talk to you too, APS, because they feel they can talk their way out of anything. They typically got nice cars, nice clothes, nice shoes, nice purses. And as we say here, it's not their first rodeo. They have done this before. They've done this several times. This is just the first time that they've actually got caught. Next slide, please. For example, to illustrate the religious connotation, this was a case out of Griffin, Georgia, where a local pastor and his wife locked disabled people in a basement of their unlicensed group home. Again, just take a look at that house. Nice looking house, normal looking house. You wouldn't know what's going on inside, but in the basement, they had locked several disabled adults in that basement, and one of them had a medical emergency. They were able to call for 911, but officers and EMS and fire couldn't get to that person in time. Next slide, please. Inside of the home, the picture on the top, there were bunk beds down in that basement. So why bunk beds? Well, they want to warehouse people. Bunk beds, pallets on the floor, taking large rooms, dividing them up into smaller rooms, because the more people they warehouse, the more money they're making. The picture there on the right shows the blister packs of medicine that I was just talking about. And the picture on the bottom was supposedly his church, but it was abandoned, boarded up, doesn't look like he's had any services in quite a while. Next slide, please. All right, next poll, Jessica. Poll number 4.
All right, so now that you know the indicators, does this sound familiar? Single choice answer. So yes, I've seen this in my own state. No, but my eyes are open to it now. So I'll give you a few seconds to take this poll. Give a few more seconds. All right, Andy, let's go ahead and close the poll. All right, so 63% says yes, I've seen this in my own state, and 37% say no, but my eyes are open to it now.
That is fantastic. I love those are great odds right there. So those of you that have seen it in your own state, if your state was not represented on that map, please hit me up and let me know. I'd love to put a star by your state. And for those of you that say no, but your eyes are open to it now, that's wonderful. I love that's the reason we talk about it, is just to have more awareness and more eyes open. Next slide, please. I want to take a minute to talk to you about Georgia's response so that you know what we've done so you can roll this out in your own state. We always want to collaborate with other states. We want to say, look, this is what's worked for us. This is what hasn't worked for us. And we have people that will hit us up and ask, you know, can we get a copy of your law? Can we talk about how you did this collaboration? Anytime that you need any sort of technical assistance like that, please reach out to me, to my team, and we will gladly help you. So what has Georgia done? We came up with a map really for investigators to show them how to follow the money, how to follow the drugs, and how to treat this like a racketeering enterprise. It's very similar to gang activity, where these traffickers, instead of running drugs through our state or running guns through our state, they are running people. They hide them out. They trade them in an underground market. These traffickers know each other, and they will trade these individuals back and forth. They will move them from place to place and trade them back and forth. We also have come up with some action items. How to search bank accounts, how to look for this money that's coming in and going out, and that often will lead to other bank accounts. How to identify those co-conspirators. And we've come up with a couple of templates too, that resident questionnaire that we talked about a minute ago, but also we've come up with a Social Security inquiry so that when an individual is experiencing this type of trafficking and their rep payee is the trafficker, for example, we can get those funds rerouted back to that individual or back to a legitimate rep payee for them. They are going to need those funds because they've got to get established into a personal care home that's licensed, and that's going to provide them the care that they need. Next slide, please. Some helpful tips just that we've come up with for law enforcement. We explain to them, you know, this is very different than your usual type of crime. It's more than just an investigation. You can arrest somebody, but an arrest is not going to solve the problem. Like I said, there's so many other traffickers out there. And if you arrest one person, you have to really arrest all the co-conspirators. You have to dismantle the entire operation. And we tell them the same thing that we tell social services or anyone else, that collaboration leads to success. They've got to collaborate the same way that adult protective services or state regulators have to. Next slide, please. One of the fabulous things that I love to talk about that Georgia has is the temporary emergency respite funds. It is a resource that we have and funds that we have in our state that's only for law enforcement, protective services, and regulatory agencies. It assists in emergency placement. for up to 7 consecutive days. That can be extended. And these funds are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this actually came out of us talking with, collaborating with law enforcement, collaborating with APS, and the law enforcement came to us and said, if we arrest a caretaker, we arrest one of these traffickers, what do we do with these people? What do we do with these victims? And again, I just love to talk about Georgia's APS. We have a unit that runs this, and they do such a fabulous job. And we have heard wonderful feedback from law enforcement about how this unit responds and how this unit has taken really a load off of law enforcement so that law enforcement can work on the criminal aspect of it, and this unit can work on placing these individuals. Next slide, please. We have some requirements for these funds. So it has to be an at-risk adult. Remember back to our first slide, an at-risk adult being someone 65 or older, 18 or older with a disability, Alzheimer's or dementia, or a resident in a facility. So it has to be an at-risk adult that lacks the ability to provide for their own basic necessities, those ADLs, right? So because they either have a disease, a disability, or some sort of cognitive impairment. And what this unit does is they'll reach out to friends and family first to see if they are willing to take their loved one back in, or if they even know where their loved one has been, right? But if not, then we can start to use these funds. And also the other requirement being is that this person is at risk of harm or threat or safety to their health if the placement is not provided immediately. Next slide, please. So I want to just leave you with a final note about collaboration. That's kind of been my theme today. It crosses state lines. We have to break down those barriers and work together. What I love about collaboration is that it empowers us. It empowers us individually, but it also empowers the work that we are doing to protect at-risk adults. And I think, and I'm sure you do too, that we need more of it in our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day work. Next slide, please. There are some references for you. If you're a big nerd like me and you like reading about this type of stuff, there are some references for you. Next slide, please. And before we jump into questions, I want to extend a big thank you to APS TARC for having me today and to all of you on the call today. It has been a pleasure to be here with you. Again, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. If it's something you don't want to ask in front of the whole group, I can give you my email address. I don't think we have it on here actually, but I can give you my email address and we can talk offline.
All right, thank you, Anna. Great presentation. Thank you so much for really diving into, especially the collaboration piece that, you know, it's difficult to work in silos, and just how much collaboration happened to really get these victims what they needed. So
definitely. So
we do have a couple questions. We have quite a few. Looks like we have quite a bit of time. So there's one question that's a couple regarding family members or visitors. Did any of these victims have family members or visitors that knew where they were or that visited them?
That's a great question. And that is kind of where these traffickers key in on. These are people that are lost, right? These are people who maybe have burned bridges with their family or have fallen through those cracks that don't have a place to go. We see some of these people that have been transported to these homes from mental health hospitals, and they have nowhere else that they can go, right? So family isn't touching base with them. They don't have visitors. And that is where the traffickers know they have that way to single out the people that are going to be left alone, to single out the people that don't have a good support system in place. And they prey on them. That was a great question.
All right, thank you. Another question we have about APS's legal authority in removing victims from these types of residences.
Great question too. I believe that it varies from state to state. As we all know, we're working with adults, right? And they can choose how to live, where they want to live, how they want to live. We've noticed in some of our investigations that these victims have told APS, I'm not leaving. This is the only place I have. I'm not going. And what I have found is that, especially our unit that I was just talking about, APS could work that magic and slowly get that person to see like, hey, this is not a good situation for you. We're going to take you somewhere where you're going to have an actual bed. You're going to get 3 meals. You can get a warm shower. And just working that magic and that speaking to them in that way that APS does gets them to say, okay, you know, you're right, this maybe wasn't the best place for me. And so when it comes to legal authority, I would definitely encourage you to look at your own policies and procedures within your state.
All right, thank you, Anna. Several people are asking for your email address. Can I go ahead and put that in the question and answer for them?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, we have another question. Have you come across cases where the trafficker has purchased life insurance on the people they are trafficking?
Yes, yes. We had just had that in, let's see, yeah, right bordering Alabama. Yes, there were several life insurance policies that she took out on the individuals. That case is still being investigated, so I can't comment too deeply about that one.
Okay. Another question, how often are illicit drugs tied into these operations?
Often. The case that I illustrated with collaboration, that involved a nurse and a pharmacist, and she was using, these were actually prescription drugs that she was using to keep these individuals docile, to keep them under her control. And she would call up the nurse and say, hey, they're getting rowdy, can you come down here? And the nurse would get money from the pharmacist. And of course, everyone's getting kickbacks here, right? And they would keep these people medicated. So any way that the traffickers can medicate these individuals and keep them under their control, they're going to use it. Great question. Great question.
All right. Got another one here. How often does the lack of a good witness victim hinder prosecution?
Well, it can. It definitely can. And we encourage, when we talk to specifically just to law enforcement about this, we tell them they have to build that case from day one, because when it gets to court, that victim either A, may be lost in the trafficking system again, if they haven't had really good case management, or they may be deceased. So having a good video, if you can, of that victim. Now, laws vary from state to state, right? But having that good video, being able to tell the story as if your victim is already deceased is what we encourage law enforcement to do. Sometimes we can't find them, you know, and that is a struggle. That's definitely a struggle for the prosecutor.
All right. Next, how did the criminal get herself on Mr. Hill's bank account? Was the financial institution liable?
Everybody asked that question, and we've asked the prosecutor too. She works closely with us. She tried her best to figure out who at the bank did that, and she could not figure it out. They could not put their finger on the person that did that. The only thing we could assume was that someone inside the bank must have known the trafficker and did that for her. Yeah, that is a question that we always wonder.
Okay. Another question, comment/question. Many of these cases seem to involve Social Security and rent payees. So have we ever gotten the office or Social Security involved to pursue these cases? So collaborating with Social Security as well?
Yes, definitely. Our unit speaks to the DOJ on the civil side and the criminal side, and also with the Inspector General's office, Social Security, and also looking at data. We've done trying to do some deep dive data with Social Security, some collaboration with them, and that's still in the works. It's great because they're willing to talk about it. They understand that this is an issue, and that they want to collaborate with us too, to see how they can protect those that are receiving Social Security. So the collaboration really never ends.
Right. A couple more questions if you're okay with that, Anna.
Oh yeah, I'm great.
Who are the traffickers primarily targeting? So homelessness with benefits, veterans, disabled?
All of the above. We sort of have this mix of unhoused individuals, but individuals that also have mental health conditions, those that have disabilities, so intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and older adults. You know, there's like that crossover between all of that. They really are con artists, like I said, and they will go to hospitals and say, here is my shiny brochure. When you are ready to discharge someone and they have nowhere to go, call me, I'll come get them. And they just kind of weasel their way into the community. So they do target those that are less fortunate and those that have nowhere else to go.
Right. Another question, do the pharmacist, nurse, and any other licensed persons end up losing their licensings for their roles in the human benefits trafficking?
Yes, the pharmacist did. As far as I know, the nurse did as well, but I cannot speak fully to that because I believe she may be under investigation in another part of our state.
Okay.
But yes, as identified co-conspirators, yes.
Great. Looks like we have a couple more. So have you had any reoffenders?
Yes, we have. We definitely have. And one reason we came up with and developed this benefits trafficking law was so that the penalty would be stiff. Because before this, it was, exploitation, right? A little bit less of a penalty here in Georgia, or false imprisonment. Repeat offenders. Now we have we have more of a punitive law in place to sentence them for longer. But also what I love about our state elder abuse prosecutor is that he gets very creative with the sentencing and says, look, they can't come back and be a rep payee, because if so, then they're going to go back to jail. They can't violate these conditions of their sentence, or they're going to be probation violation. So you have to get crafty, because they're not going to stop. This is what they know how to do. This is their con. This is their job.
All right. One other question. It's a great question, but very broad question. I really appreciate it. How do we locate these homes in our communities?
Oh, fantastic question.
Yes.
So if you are in the space where you are doing field visits or you're going into homes, just keeping your eyes open. If there's a certain part of the house where maybe the caretaker says you can't go, especially a basement, or a locked room, you can't go in there. Look around and see what you see. Are you seeing locks on certain places in the house or outside of the house? Are you seeing a person that is going to the hospitals? You kind of get wind of somebody that's going to hospitals or to the Salvation Army and collecting people. And that's where that collaboration comes in, is talking to those other agencies and saying, do you have anybody that kind of fits this? Or go to the hospital, to your hospital social workers, and say, do you have someone that is offering to take people into their homes? And that's going to give you some leads, definitely, but really just keeping your eyes open. I mean, I drive through my own community and I'm constantly looking, and you'll notice people outside hanging around, but you'll also notice that the neighbors know a lot about what's happening in these certain houses, and they can tell you what's going on. It's really being vigilant and you attending this training, and so now your eyes are open. And I always say, it's so cliche, but if you see something, say something. You could be the one that really rescues these people. That was a wonderful question.
Absolutely. APS is the eyes and ears for the client, so good.
They are.
Finally, how do you determine if a care home is licensed or unlicensed in your state?
Awesome. So in Georgia, we have what's called Healthcare Facility Regulation Division, and they are in charge of the licensing for personal care homes. I'm not sure what that looks like for each person for each state, but we can go onto their website and we can find out if a facility is licensed or not. Great question. So I encourage you to get with your state regulators to see if you have that kind of registry in your own state. It's required for licensed facilities to be listed on that website here in Georgia. And it's good. I use it personally. I also use it professionally just to check on certain places. I use it as a reference and as a resource tool.
Excellent. Well, Anna, on behalf of APS TARC, again, thank you so much. Your presentation was absolutely informative, and you got lots of thank yous in the question and answer in the chat. So stay in touch, contact and follow us. We have all of our information up here. And thank you all for attending today and investing in your own professional development and keeping our older and disabled adult population free from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.